Hello, everyone. Welcome to the next episode of Chirpin Time. I am your host, David Shoulders. This is our interview show with authors and clients of Little Birds, a newly founded literary publicity agency. And we are so excited to have Pauletta Hansel here today. We're going to be talking about her new forthcoming book called Understory, a women's history of Appalachia. It'll be out from the University Press of Kentucky on October 27th of this year. So really excited about this. What is it? It said that you have 10 poetry collections in your bio. I've probably known you for about 3 or 4 of them so far.
Mhm.
Um,
I think that's true.
so I'm really excited about this sort of hybrid version of a book, and I'm so glad that you published with Kentucky Press for this. And so we're just going to have a delightful conversation. I really look forward to it.
Thank you, Davis. I do too.
Yeah, to get us going, just tell us a little bit about yourself and the journey that has brought you to the writing of this book.
Well, I live in Cincinnati, Ohio, but I was born and raised in southeastern Kentucky to parents who were born and raised in southeastern Kentucky. One of the things, especially as I've gotten older, that I've understood about myself and have said before is that I live in just barely in the north, right? Just over the river. I live in the Midwest. But my writing really does live in Appalachia. And so, in a lot of ways, Understory, A Women's History of Appalachia, is an outgrowth of a career-long interest in writing about the lives of women in particular, who are associated with the Appalachian region where I'm from and where my family is from.
So this book started 20 years ago, right? There was a someone you knew
Mhm.
who put out the challenge that uh, I can trace your Appalachian ancestor, right?
Right,
Um,
right.
so tell us a little bit about that and how you became a accidental historian.
Yeah, yeah. So yes, it was probably almost 20 years ago when a friend, the late Danny Miller, who was himself an Appalachian writer and scholar and also a amateur genealogist, as it turned out, I heard him actually overheard him say to someone else. So I was just being nosy that he had discovered that he could kind of trace his family history and find a relationship with almost anyone from the South or from Appalachia. And I was just, I was sort of being bratty, and I said, I bet you can't trace me, And I knew a few family members past my grandparents, but not that many. But one name I knew was Sarah Margaret Roten from Virginia. And when I said that name, his eyes sort of like rolled back in his head or lit up. It turns out that my first great grandmother actually was a member of a family that Danny and his cousin had traced all the way back to Jamestown and actually even beyond. And he had heard that name. He definitely knew the name Roten, which is spelled in southwestern Virginia, Rhoton or Rhoten, but mine is the double O. He had definitely heard her name, but he had no sort of real contact or ability to trace her past the fact that she was born to the family that he was tracing. And she was a Jamestown bride, which was really kind of interesting. A mail order bride before there was mail, as as I like to say. Um, who had been sent over, had agreed to come over to the quote unquote New World in exchange for marriage. And her, the right to marry her was to be in exchange for 150 pounds of tobacco leaves, which is why they were called tobacco brides or Jamestown brides. So I thought that was really interesting. And Danny gave me a little bit of the history that he had been tracing. I shared it with my family, and everybody said, "Oh, that's so cool," blah blah blah. And then that was really it until I was finishing up the poems in my second to last book, Heartbreak Tree, which is was really squarely on the subject of Appalachian women, particularly my family. And I needed a few more poems. So Danny, unfortunately, was long gone. He had died just very young, just a few years after he had told me this. But by now, the kind of the internet explosion, the genealogy explosion had really kind of happened. And so it was easy to find information about her. And I wrote a few poems and I thought, okay, well, that's cool, and thought that was it, but it wasn't it. I was continued to be fascinated by her life and also by the women who came after her. And so even though I have another book in between Heartbreak Tree and this forthcoming book, Understory, I continued tracing the line, doing a little bit of genealogy here and there, doing some research, and writing more poems, and realized eventually that I was writing a book. And so that's what I did.
That is amazing. And I will have to say it's impressive how much of your ancestry you recover and how much time you spent in the poetic sections, right? In the
Mhm.
poetry parts to really sort of see and witness. So I'm wondering that that's a big project. What
Mhm.
was and this kind of fell in your lap, but what became that sort of prodding force to be able to go through 300 years, 400 years of history, 14
Yeah.
generations?
14 generations, 400 years. I started really just about for almost exactly 400 years after the family had come over from England, or after the grandmother had come over from England in 1621 is about the time I started writing the poems. Um, so, it's I think it's it with any obsession, but particularly perhaps a literary obsession, you just keep following the path. You just kind of keep taking it back and seeing where it leads you. And in my case, what I came to understand fairly quickly, relatively speaking, it was 20 years since I started it, but once the obsession began, I came to understand fairly quickly that I was not just looking at my family history, that I was looking at a history of the Appalachian region and of the United States. I mean, the family were here before the United States were formed and lived on the East Coast in the Chesapeake Bay area for several generations, for you know more than really almost 200 years, about 150 years. So it just seemed like that if I kept open to learning, and to learning specifically about how my family fit within this larger history and larger narrative of the creation of this country and the white people settling of Appalachia, that I might be able to present a history that had not been presented exactly this way before, because it was focusing, on a particular family and their journey, and more specifically on the journey of the women. And so I think that was a piece of it, that it's, that writing about my own family history was certainly very interesting to me, but understanding that I might have a story that was relevant to more than just me and my family is what kind of kept pushing me forward.
Hmm.
Plus, it was fun. It's I think I have been interested in writing poetry for many years, that kind of moves outside the individual narratives and pulls information from various sources. And this was the opportunity to do that on a much larger scale. And I originally thought that I would just be writing poetry, but as I began to do the work, there was more that I wanted to say and more that I was learning. And I'm sort of like history or genealogy nerd now, so there's a whole lot more that I know, about this history than actually made it into the book. But that there was more that I wanted to say, and I didn't want to weight down the poems with the amount of detail that I felt could be shared and be of interest to readers. And so I began writing prose pieces as well to go along with it. And all of that, I mean, to a certain degree, that was sort of accidental stumbling along as well. I had gone on a research trip to Southwest Virginia, Southwestern Virginia. Need to make sure to say that Western, so we know we're not talking
Question.
about the state. All right. So into Southwestern Virginia right before I came back to Eastern Kentucky for my Southern Appalachian Writers Cooperative meeting. And so I read some of the writing they had done about that journey. And a good friend of mine, Sherry Cook Stansforth, said, you really need to include that travel uh, narrative in your piece. And it's like, oh, I never thought of that. And then, shortly after that, I was asked to do a presentation at the Mildred Hahn Festival in East Tennessee. And this was what I was working on, and I knew, and so I wanted to do like a presentation that included the poems, but weren't just the poems because it was a keynote, so they were looking for something a little broader. So I began to weave together that material from my historical research, but also the travel pieces to kind of give the poem some context and put some pictures in and all of that, and um, and then one of the presenters of the conference said, I really hope you can publish this as a hybrid book. And it's like, oh, I never thought of that. So I would be nothing without help from my friends who have all these good ideas about what I should do. And and then I do them.
Well, I think it's a lovely form, and I think people should. There's kind of this strength in sort of you having a long career of doing this, and then coming out with the form of a book that is uh, something that you have a strong suit in, right, with the poetry,
Yeah.
and then giving us the captions and the mission statements and the details. It's very refreshing to read. I will say
Oh,
that
good.
in hybrid.
I'm glad because it's a big book. So I'm
Yeah.
glad it was
Yes.
refreshing and not a slog.
It did not feel dense at all in
Good.
the details. So some of what you were saying makes me want to call on this subtitle as a women's history, right? Because you mentioned that okay, women didn't even get names or inscriptions or noted, right? And and we've talked about you are more familiar with the Appalachian, the Kentucky, the Virginia part of your ancestry, but that going back, you learned a lot about um, sort of finding the women in the cracks, right? The atrocious deeds of some of the men, but also some of the honest deeds and some of the rawness that is the early life here. Um, but I'm curious, as you connected to those older women, and as you progress too, and you even learn things about your Appalachian ancestry. What I think that the difference that your life now as a woman and the feminism that you've spoken to in your poetry is has been a journey, from the family origins to now. So I'm actually curious about how, as you were giving them life on the page, as you were mirroring them in these poems, how did the difference, in fact, that you found with the women sort of bleed into the way that you sort of reckoned and shined a light on these women in the page? Because they're already invisible. And then what you found visibly at times was not who you are now, who
Right.
you've
Yeah.
become as a woman.
Yeah, and no, that's absolutely true. And it has been an interesting journey of discovery about these women and about just the variations and sort of the waves of relative prosperity and then actual lack of prosperity in the family's life, which I think probably is not all that unusual in especially for people families who migrated into the Appalachian region. But so one thing I would say just straight out is that I was able to find out a lot more information about Margaret Dawson Roten Attawell Grimes, who was born around 1600. We don't know her exact birth date. I was able to find out a lot more information about her than I was about my own great grandmother. Um, and and that in itself was interesting, and I think that might have helped spur me to make this decision to really focus in on the women because they disappeared. So there was a lot about her because she was one of the few white women in Virginia in what became the United States. And she married 3 times and she got a little richer every time. And she was in and out of court a lot for various things, mostly around property. And so researchers were interested in her. So she showed up in several articles, journal articles, historical journal articles. And so I was able to I mean, I even know the color of her petticoats, red, by the way.
Oh yeah,
So
we're going to talk about
yeah,
that.
yeah. And so I had all this information about her, and then a little bit about the next generation. She showed up in a will, in her father's will, and then a little bit about the next generation, and then nothing. There's the next grandmother, Hannah. No one knew her last name. She might have been this, she might have been that. We know more or less when she died because her husband married again, so we knew that. The next generation, not even not it's like the first, maybe this was her first name, maybe it wasn't. It probably is because of, her husband's will or, whatever. And then sort of moving on from there. And then also learning that eh, the there was no I could find can put it this way. I can find no documentation that any woman in this particular line that I'm tracing was literate up into my mother.
Hmm.
And so maybe that's a long way of getting back to your question, because I think that is one of the huge differences in my life and the lives of my grandmothers. I can read and write. And as such, I almost feel as if I have an obligation. I have a moral obligation to tell their story in a way that can be shared with others because they could not. They had no opportunity to uh, to do this up until my mother, who actually left us a 500-page memoir that we found when we needed to move her into the memory care unit of the nursing home. And so, that was, and I think that was a piece of it too, that my mother, unbeknownst to me, when I was able to actually talk to her about it, had this huge desire to make her story known. And if she was able to quietly, in her home, um, make this narrative of her life, then I felt almost honor bound to continue it. And I got a little bit of an overachiever because I went back 400 years. She only went back to 1932. I went back to
Well, I was going to say, and just hearing you talk, that one of the things that we know about Appalachian history is that is the region that we are mostly based and work in, is that it has a vanishing history, and that there's a
yeah.
sense that a lot of history vanishes. But in you going back farther, you show us how it started to thin out
Mhm.
in the time in Kentucky. And I think that's really something that I think the country as a whole and its zeitgeist of U.S. history in our 250th year, where people are reflecting on this, um, have sometimes there's a sense of old East Coast, oldest, so if things moved past Appalachia, then they're newer than Appalachia,
Mhm,
right?
mhm, mhm.
And I think that that the story that you're talking about, these women losing favor, losing agency, losing literacy, losing wealth, is a story of many communities who have found their way to Appalachia.
Yeah.
Mm.
No, I think that's absolutely true. And it's Appalachia's history is a very complicated history for sure. I do try to speak to it from a personal and individualized perspective, but my family's history is only one piece of that vanishing history. And, so when you think about it, it's like they were part of the vanishing of a population that has a much longer history on this planet than my rodents ever have. The rodents tended to show up after the indigenous population had already been displaced, with the exception of in the Jamestown area that it my 10th great grandfather Ezekiel Roten was very likely involved in actively displacing the Native American population. Well, wouldn't have been Native American at that point, right? He was involved in actively displacing the indigenous population from the Jamestown area. But after that, we tended to just kind of show up after the hard work had already been done, after whole whole families of people had been moved from their ceremonial hunting grounds or their actual living spaces, depending on where they were moving. But it's so we were part of that vanishing history, and then we vanished ourselves, which I think is kind of part of this larger story of who we are as a nation, in a
And,
sense.
and to that point, you've done a great job of honoring sort of both the act of vanishing and the reflexiveness of how your family was vanished. You mentioned many of the tribal names, many of the forgotten names. You do not shy away from saying families that were slaveholders, and in this sort of ugly truth that we have to hold, especially as white people. I'm just curious how you felt. You're learning about your own family's oppression and act of oppressing. But how did it feel to to honor and acknowledge that, with the poems specifically that you brought in, because that is the work that we all have to do, and it is both, important and noble, but it is also deeply personal. And I was just curious, how did it feel to put the narrative of your family as oppressors along the story of those who were oppressed?
Well, I understood that I really needed to, and I think, I mean, one thing about poetry is that if it is not used for truth telling, then it really isn't doing its job. So I mean, you can't, I mean, sure, you can hide in poetry if you want to. I mean, you can certainly tell it slant, which is not exactly hiding. It still is another way of telling the truth. But, ultimately, poetry is a very intimate form of communication, and any real attempt to hide or gloss over destroys the poem because it destroys the authenticity of the relationship between the poem and the reader. And so I honestly didn't feel like I had any choice, that if I learned something, then I needed to be able to speak to it in some way if it was at all relevant to this history of women and in Appalachia and my family that I was trying to tell. There is a sense, certainly, that every time I would discover something, it was like, oh shoot, it's like here we go again. We're not, we're not free of the slaveholding history. It's like we're not free of this, this kind of really oppressive relationship with people who lived here before. but the freeing part, I guess, was the sense of being able to actually speak it openly and to tell the truth about a history that should not be further vanished by being varnished, basically. It just it's these are stories that needed to be said. I mean, they're far enough away from me in time that it's not as if it was my mother or my grandmother, having this relationship uh, with individuals, but still, it's my family, and I wouldn't be here if it weren't for for the ways in which these men and women treated this land that was not theirs, and took ownership of people who could not be owned at at the heart and at their soul.
I agree, as you say, that the honesty is the path to the freedom, and you don't speak with any hesitation about the truths of the family. And I think that that allows sort of an example for us to, because a lot of people are doing genealogy now, right? We said we have all these tools online, and it's easy to whitewash that
Hmm.
experience as well.
Yeah.
And so I think, you're leading by example in that regard. Let's talk about the travel of this because I'm really much about the physicality of place, right? And that is also that's the key element of your prose. Like we get to see and your internal dialogue a little bit. And it's like, oh, well, there's this tree that I said. Oh, the tree fell on a car and the ancestors didn't want us to go. But when you did actually get to these places in Jamestown and you're like, I got to get to that
Right.
island, right? You're
That's
doing
right.
all I mean, there's so much that our ancestors built, bridges, buildings, farms,
Right.
trade. I was thinking of tobacco as
Mhm.
the tobacco bride and as the object, the baptismal font. How did it feel though, from your personal experience of traveling, to sort of resonate and rest with where either physical objects that they had touched or had known, regardless of their, morality at the time. Like, how did it feel to be in these various places?
Yeah. Well, a lot of what I learned kind of from a historical and even genealogist, a lot of what I learned from a historical standpoint and even a genealogy standpoint was at the computer or in a library. But there's no way that I could have written poems without actually having some sense of the place where the family lived. That, it's a place-based book. And so to know the difference, just on a sort of physical level, to feel the difference between the swamps of Delaware and Maryland in particular, which was very hot, by the way, to the little knobs of what's now called Yadkin County, North Carolina, but would have been Surrey County at the time, that they call hills and mountains, but it's, they're you can put them in your pocket as far as I'm concerned, to then going into the huge, sort of looming mountains of Western, North Carolina and then on into Southwestern Virginia. It just gave me a sense of um, what that, what our family's journey was as they moved from place to place, that in places that were just radically different from each other. And they walked there. I mean, I took the highway. I stayed at a Marriott, for heaven's sakes,
You didn't walk
along the
Daniel
way.
Boone's road?
I did not, well, I walked a little bit of it, but it's it's if they actually experienced these differences in temperature and and in height and all of that, through their bodies, through this active migration that involved walking with their feet. I could at least do it in a car. I owed that to them, but I also owed it to myself. I mean, that was one of the funnest parts of the work. That was one of the most enjoyable parts of the work was actually being able to see these places, even though maybe we got close to one and maybe they lived over that hill over there. It's like it's so much has vanished and changed. It's really hard to know. But at least I had a sense of the location in my body.
Yeah, and that leads me to sort of the premise of the title, right? The understory, and that you know you approximated knowledge, and you approximated poetic feeling through the undergrowth,
Yeah.
right? And I mean, again, as a poet, you're going to be versed in ecological metaphors, and especially a poet from Appalachia, you are. Um, but I kept being struck by that, the taxonomical records that you
Mm.
place, the specific trees that you mention, the poplar, the relation to the age of the poplar. I, I want to hear you talk a little bit about the sort of, so from physical landscape to sort of the fauna itself,
Mhm.
the metaphor of roots, as we know from the famous Alex Haley, is deep for genealogy. It is a very natural genealogy is considered a very natural metaphor. So I'm just curious about the naming of the collection and the environmental metaphors that's were sustained in this book.
Yeah. Well, I think, one of the things I know you're referring to are the list poems that are scattered throughout the book. And one of the things that I was really conscious of in writing a book of this length is that I couldn't keep writing the same poem over and over again. And when there's a limited amount of information about a population of people, then I have to turn away from sometimes from my natural bent, which is towards storytelling, into looking at the context of the story. And one of the ways that I did that was by trying to understand what what plants and what animals, the family would have lived in close proximity to. And luckily, they have really cool names, you know. There's all of these little critters kind of moving around. And so it lent itself to kind of list making, to understand kind of the tex, taxonomy of the location by just naming. So it was a craft decision to a certain degree, to kind of step outside the story and look outside the window and step outside the door to kind of see what else was there that these women and men would have been stepping into. Um, so a craft decision, but also a way of, for myself anyway, of trying to understand the larger context.
Well, it worked beautifully, and I do think this notion of naming, sometimes we think you use the word complicit, that poetry, and you talk about the root is complicated. Sometimes we think things have to be complicated because they're old or because but some of the simplest acts of naming, of saying aloud, or of calling out an ancestor, as you do directly in some of the pieces, that the naming for the record is sort of its own sacred act in writing. So I really appreciate that.
And the
Um,
naming too is part of, is part of a defense against the vanishing because many of the critters, especially that I name, are endangered species. Even now, and in another 10 years, are they actually going to be there? Just like the people are not necessarily going to be able to stay in the community as time goes on.
and that goes back to what you said before, the vanishing before the second vanishing,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
taking care of our world.
Yeah.
uh, that we inhabit.
Yeah. And in terms of the question of your question about the name Understory, that's another one I kind of stumbled into. It's I did not have a name for this collection as I was beginning to work with it. But as I was kind of reading and writing, and going out into the world, uh, this concept of of the understory of the part of the forest floor which is really not seen or really considered when you're kind of tromping through the forest, but is really so critical to the well-being of that of that um, of that ecosystem. And that's kind of what women do or have through history, is to be ignored and yet critical to the well-being of the society.
Hmm. Yes, any marginalized group, Appalachia is an understory. We keep things
Right.
together, however
Yeah.
we're
Yeah.
perceived.
Yeah. And then of course the story under the story. It began with a poem that I called Understory, and then it's like, oh, that might work for a title. This idea of sort of continuing to look on a more narrative level to see what's underneath the main story that's being told.
As we keep going, we're coming out to the big picture now. So for a couple things, but I want to ask you how you feel having written this book, having gone on these journeys. What is your current relationship to your ancestors? Do you've practiced embodied them? Is there a sense in which you feel closer to the women, to the grannies? And do you hear their voice in ways?
No, I absolutely do feel closer to the grannies. One of the ways that I was able often to write poems about the grandmothers was through, again, a craft technique that's called persona poems, and that's, writing in the voice of the person that you're writing about. And so there is a way in which, you know, through imagination for sure, but, there's a way in which I feel as if I physically embodied certain grandmothers in order to be able to write about them. And, and I'm not saying that I was possessed, although, I certainly was possessed by this project. And there are many people who say I'm still possessed, but, I'm not talking about it in necessarily in a metaphysical way, but in a poetic way, in a spiritual, in a spiritual way for sure, that I feel as if by the act of paying attention, to the minute details of these women's lives, which is really all I had, to pay attention to, was these minute details, that I was able to make a connection on some spiritual and imaginative plane. And there's also, the sense of having been carried here by them. It's like I think, I don't really think anymore so much about sort of genealogy or ancestry in the sense of how I am going to be carried forward. I tend to think of it more in terms of how I was carried here. And so the rest will take care of itself, right? I mean, in a way that it's like if I was carried forward by these women whom I don't know, but would not be here but for them, even though I don't have biological children, I know that there are ways in which I am carrying, the next generations as well, just like we all are. So it's not me in a special way, but me in the sense of that we all um, are stepping stones, to what's next. But I prefer to think of it less of stepping stones and more of carrying, because that's more of a sense of, I think, of relationship.
Yeah, the birthing and the surrogacy and we know there's plenty of complications about how we are born or where we're born or who
Mhm.
we're born to, but the fact is that we are carried, we are transmitted, and the story of how we get here is our story.
Yeah.
And I think that again, you honor that so deeply. So
Thank
we're
you.
gonna do two more
Okay.
questions because I we mentioned it earlier, and I was like, you wore as soon as you got on the call, I was like, you wore your red. So t tell us about the color red because it appears a lot to
It
you.
does. Well, I mean, one thing I will say is that from sort of a both fashion and decorating point standpoint, red is my signature color. It started a long time ago with my mother, actually, some dishes that she gave me when I was still just a teenager moving into my own apartment. So little pops of red here and there. But it's just I've always been very attracted to the color, and then I wear it a lot, and a lot of my kind of household decorating is with red. I have a red car. Actually, I say that's not a surprise since I say that in a poem. Um, so there was that. But then as I was researching Margaret, the 10th great grandmother, the Jamestown bride, it was mentioned in her will that she passed on a red petticoat, to her daughter, and someone speculated that that petticoat, might have been passed on to someone else. And I knew that one of the things that the Jamestown women had received from the Virginia Company of London as they sent them over to be married, sort of a dowry, were petticoats, which were likely red because that's the color that would have been most likely to be at that particular time. So it just picked up, the idea that it was a color that I loved, and it was also a color that actually showed up in a will from 1650 something, was just very interesting to me. And so, again, as a craft decision, when you're writing a book of that length, it's nice to have little threads that readers can kind of carry, kind of can lead them from one generation to another. And so I allowed the fact that red is my color, and red is certainly a color that would have been present in Margaret's life to continue on.
Well, and I even not to because it's a spoiler, but because it is again very honest. There's this metaphor, right, with the red petticoat, and then your beginning of life in the creek and beginning
Right.
of the flowing,
That's
right,
right.
of
Yeah.
the weird
Right.
history. It
Yeah.
is it
Yeah.
is our blood and our lineage and our
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
the path of life, right,
That's right.
right.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I saw it. I'm just saying I
Thank
saw what
you.
you
I'm
were
glad you
doing.
saw it. Well, I'm glad it worked for you, right? As
The
a as
red
a
apple,
to
the
carry
red
through.
leaf.
That's
Now we're
right.
looking for it. Now I know red means something to you, so I'm gonna look for it.
It does. Yeah.
Um, well, this has been lovely. We've been chatting all across the board, poetry, history. Again, I just do think that your experience as a writer has really come together and you're compressing in an enjoyable way. So our final question that we like to ask our guests, because we are the little birds, if your book was a bird, what kind of bird would it be?
Well, it's like the first thing that pops into my head, so I will just say it, and then I'll have to figure out why, is a hawk. And hawks have been on my mind lately because I had a little visitation from one not too long ago. A young red-shouldered hawk came to sit on my porch for a while, and stayed around for much of the afternoon. And I associated him or her, who knows, uh, well, someone knows, but I don't know, with my father. But I think there is a way in which the book is a kind of circling. It's circling the family, and it is. I mean, it is chronological. I did for the most part, that was a choice that I made early on because I was just confusing my reader too much by jumping around all over the place. So kind of gave it that chronological history. But there, even within the chronology, there's a way that it always circles back. That there's no way to kind of stay in a very in a linear history. It's it can be chronological, but there still needs to be the circling. Um, I should probably know more about hawks in order to really use this as a metaphor. So perhaps I will do that research. But I also do have a sense of these birds of prey as being both big picture and then also swooping in to be able to see what needs to be seen close up. Um, I'm not trying to eat my my subjects as a hawk might, but there is still this idea of kind of moving in close to get what
They
they
are
need.
regal and observing creatures,
They
and
are. They are.
and I think this is a regal and observing book.
Oh, thank you.
And
Thank you for giving me the metaphor, right?
well, maybe it's a red-tailed hawk too. Again, I don't know
Yeah.
that much about
Yeah, or
birds.
red-shouldered, which is the
Or
one that I had found.
or
Yeah.
red-breasted. I don't know. There's yeah. We'll check with the biologist to see.
That's right.
But anyway, thank you again so much, Pauletta.
Thank
Again,
you, Davis.
Understory hits shelves anywhere books are sold. October 2027. Of course, you can check in with all Pauletta's website and Little Bird social media. We'll be posting about all the great events and ways to connect with the journey of the book tour, the journey to write the book, and then the journey of sharing the book. And so we're just honored that you've taken the time with us today.
Thank you, Davis. I really appreciate it. I enjoyed talking to you very much.
Little birds, you plant the seed, we spread the word. Take the truth you speak far across the land. Little birds, if you ain't got time to chirp, take your dreams, give them wings to make them soar across the sky. Oh, little birds, oh, little birds, ba-ba-da-ba-ba, little birds, ba-ba-da-ba-ba-ba, little birds. Little birds, little birds, we spread the word.